Hi guys, in this video I have a discussion with Thersites the Historian about a number of topics to do with the American election, including what things might look like under a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency, what prospects the left has in 2024, including who will be the next progressive champion, what Biden needs to do to win the election, and ways that the left can change politics outside of the election, as well as a bunch more. This is going to be a long and fruitful discussion, so grab a coffee, wash dishes, do whatever you need to do, and enjoy the show.
Hello everybody, this is Thersites the Historian. I'm here with a YouTube user, MyTake. We're going to be looking at a number of issues pertinent to the 2020 election cycle and beyond. First of all, we'll discuss the harm reduction argument for Joe Biden, or as I call it here, the damage reduction argument because it abbreviates to DRAW. We'll talk about the full context of that, the assumptions that go into it, and then some scenarios, seeing what would happen if Biden's elected or if Trump is reelected. We'll then move on to talk about 2020 prospects for the left more broadly, and also how, rather, Biden can actually win back the left, which right now seems to be a major problem. And finally, we'll conclude by going beyond 2020 and talking about the strategy the left can pursue going forward, and some of the institutions that the left can cultivate in order to gain success. So welcome, MyTake. How are you doing?
Hi guys, this is MyTake. I'm doing quite well. So thank you for letting me onto the stream, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And so I thought maybe I could start with a quote, if that's fine.
Sure.
And it's a quote from sort of the 5 stages of fascism, and the quote goes this. It says, fascism rises from a deadlock of constitutional government, a weak liberal, an advancing left, conservative leaders who refuse to govern with the left and feel unable to continue to govern against the left without further reinforcement. Would you say that describes America, those characteristics?
Broadly speaking, yeah. Although it's been that case for at least 10 years at this point.
No, that's definitely true. And so I think it's kind of in that context, if we want to sort of discuss about the possibility of some kind of authoritarian push under Trump in a second term.
Right, because
I think it's within that context.
Yeah, just for the broader context, we had a preliminary discussion, and when we're talking about the damage reduction argument, I mean, I think we both agree that sort of one of the most fundamental questions that goes into the issue is whether or not a fascist takeover by Trump is plausible. So I think that's...
Yeah, indeed. Because basically I think the harm reduction argument, it's basically, you could divide it into sort of 2 things. One is, of course, the policy thing, things like the Supreme Court, the environment, and then the other is indeed more the greater threat to liberal democracy, if that's sort of a viable argument. And I would say that in many ways, when it comes to Trump, I think most of us could agree that there is definitely an authoritarian trend in the Trump administration, and I think the question is how far can he push that?
Sure. Well, it's a good question. In terms of him pulling off some sort of a coup, I guess the one major thing going for him is that there are people who are more or less cheerleading for that possibility. The what is it called? The QAnon community is basically saying Trump should arrest all his enemies, and it wouldn't be fascist because he's Trump. And on the other hand, one thing I find very encouraging is he doesn't seem to have much actual support from members of the military, which would make a coup pretty difficult. So if you look at the donations that 2020 candidates got from military members, I believe Trump finished 5th behind 4 different Democrats, and Bernie was actually number 1. Buttigieg, I think, was number 2, maybe. And then Trump was a distant 5th. So that means that it would be very hard for people to rally the military in order to try to empower Trump further. That being said, I mean, there are definitely people in the civilian population, many of whom own a large number of guns, who are all about some Trump for life.
No, but on the military, I wouldn't be quite as confident because I mean, of course, 2020 was mostly a Democratic primary, so I can't imagine that many people are donating to Trump as of yet. And in 2016, I believe it was both Sanders and Trump who were the most popular among the military. So
Yeah.
even if, let's say, there wouldn't be any kind of unified military against Trump, I think a scenario where Trump somehow calls into question the legitimacy of the election and calls for, some kind of violence or uprising. Hypothetically, you could have a split military, so not necessarily that everyone would line up behind Trump, but that there
Right.
would be, segments and sections that could be on his side, which
Yeah,
would create its own.
I could imagine that happening because normally what you see, at least from Obama to forward, is that the rank and file had become Democrat because the military had become majority millennial. The officer corps was still Republican, and it still is Republican, but a lot of the officers in the military are of the more never Trump, or at least Trump skeptical variety.
Yeah.
And part of that is because they all have a very professional bias in the sense that they look at someone like Trump and they don't see him going through the same qualification process that they themselves went through. You think about the military, I mean, they have to not only have a degree, go through RTC or a military academy, then they have to certify for all kinds of different skills, go to different training sessions. So it's very professional class oriented. And then Trump
Yeah.
is very much against that mold because he's very, he's literally just born in his position.
No, agreed on that. I think the military coup scenario is probably the most sort of cartoonish or outlandish.
Yeah,
But I think maybe what people more need to look at is sort of more of a slow march towards more authoritarian practices.
sure.
And you don't even need to just look at Trump. I mean, come on. When did the military or the Constitution stop Obama or Bush from spying on Americans
That's
or
true.
torturing people? Things that are unconstitutional. This is not unprecedented.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about that. It's I think it's been since it was a Johnson or Nixon who passed the War Powers Act. Uh, we've had an imperial presidency, and the office has become massively overpowered vis-a-vis the rest
Yeah.
of the government, and that's a major problem I think structurally that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure if the outcome of 2020 will address that, but that's definitely something that people need to be talking about a lot.
No, indeed, because I think what's more likely to happen, indeed, is something of that nature. That say that Trump wins, that he will continue on some things that he's already started on, and I think for this we need to look probably more to some of this stuff, like with the border crisis. Because I mean, it was already proposed, for instance, that some of these illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, that the children would be sent, for instance, to military bases. I mean, these are kind of things that it kind of gives you an uncomfortable feeling when you start rounding up groups of people, putting them in special facilities, maybe camps, if you want to call it. Like, I think this is the kind of stuff that would continue, sort of, if Trump won in 2020.
Yeah, I feel like some of the practices that, especially the children in cages and family separations, that's the one area where the Democrats actually fought back. I feel like for the most part, what
Yeah.
we've seen with the so-called resistance is that they are extraordinarily selective in their resistance, and they are mostly
Yeah.
fine with all of Trump's priorities.
No, indeed, that's I think one of the big things is that whatever Trump does, if it's sort of in favor of the establishment, no one resists him. I think the scariest thing, I think, was somewhere in the beginning of the Trump administration, he dropped the mother of all bombs, I think, on Afghanistan. And Fareed Zakaria, a guy who's a massive Trump critic, basically fawned over him. He said, now Trump is becoming a president. Look how beautiful the explosion is. Like, when it comes to things like this, the military industrial complex, they're all in it together. It's crazy
Yes.
how it goes.
It's also interesting you bring that up. I remember there was a clip, I know Jimmy Dore plays it all the time, of, I think it's Brian Williams watching a cruise missile launch, and he said that he's just awestruck by the beauty of our weapons. And
Oh god.
there's
Yeah.
also even John Oliver, who I guess is normally considered part of the left. If it comes to the military industrial complex, I think his wife is some kind of contractor, And
Oh, wow.
yeah, whenever it really comes down to criticizing the military-industrial complex, he'll never go very far. He'll criticize all kinds of other stuff, but mostly it's harmless social conservatives like creationists or faith healers or people who don't really have a lot of power. You know, they can only harm a few individuals at a time, but they're not really
No.
institutionally entrenched in any way.
No, indeed, it's a little sad. It's a little sad to see this. And yeah, indeed, it's just that. I mean, for instance, Elizabeth Warren voted for Trump's military budget expansion, and I mean, it kind of leaves you with little hope to
Are
think that even someone more on the left than probably most of the people in government is still on board with some of these things.
Yeah, no, Warren has been pretty disappointing really the last couple years. Not only that, but when Trump said we'll never be socialist, she stood up and applauded.
Really? Wait, really?
Yeah, during that
Oh,
portion, she stood up and applauded very visibly.
oh,
And
wow.
she said that she's a capitalist to her bones and some other comments of that nature. Which I guess if she's trying to break that distinction that she's not a socialist, it makes sense. But at the same time,
You know,
uh, applauding the kind of capitalism that Trump, clearly is in favor of, probably not a smart idea, I think, and also really makes one question Warren's commitments.
no, indeed, it's honestly quite scary to see. And I saw an interesting thing about the 14 characteristics of fascism,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll quickly read them in a sec. But it's scary to think how many of them are characteristic of Trump, but the other scary thing is how many of them are characteristic of America even before Trump.
Yes.
And of the ones characteristic of America, like I could name, there's supremacy of the military. I mean, that's been ongoing for the past few decades. Obsession with national security started at least under Bush, or if not earlier. Religion and government intertwined. Uh, Not 100%, but I feel like it's moving in that way. Corporate power protected
Yes.
is another one. I mean, that's very big. That's very big. But I think one of some of the more scarier ones under Trump is disdain for human rights. And not to say that any American president has been respectful of human rights when it's people in the Middle East. I think if you look at sort of Trump's rhetoric within America, excluding foreign policy, like the way he talks about, certain groups of people, and he has a sort of very, very clever trick where he takes a group of people that's sort of bad, let's say, like MS-13, and he kind of conflates them with people who are not really bad, let's say all illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants.
Sure.
So he'll say something about illegal immigration that hints at MS-13, and then of course when liberals defend, then he says, "Oh, you see, the liberals are defending MS-13," and he'll start calling people dogs or they're animals. He'll say things like this, dehumanizing terms,
Yes.
and at the same time he'll call for sort of punishments that clearly violate human rights. He'll say things like, we just beat the shit out of them, all of these kind of things, and it's really reminiscent of sort of the rise to power of other authoritarian leaders. Because I think too many people, when they make these comparisons, they say, well, Trump is Hitler, or Trump can't be Hitler because, no one is being put into camps or whatever. And obviously that's not the case, and no one is saying that. But if you look at the rise to power of things, how these things start, for instance, by delegitimizing the media or by dehumanizing certain minority groups, I think that has massively ramped up under Trump, and it will massively increase if he wins. And to finish that argument off, basically, is that if you look at any time Trump is in trouble, what's his go-to? His go-to is always, always, always to vilify some sort of enemy. So even with the coronavirus, he's trying to sort of stir up that anti-immigration rhetoric, even in the context of coronavirus, where it doesn't fully really make sense. I mean, okay, there was the travel ban from China, but it doesn't really make sense to start stirring up against the Chinese, but not really saying outright Chinese. But every time, that's his go-to card. And I think, if he would get a second term, he's really going to ramp that stuff up.
Well, I guess it's hard to predict if the second term would be much different. That being said, if you think about the characteristics of fascism that you just read, scarily enough, that applies to almost all of our modern presidents. Maybe not some of the hardcore race baiting, but I mean, even on the subtler level, trying to smear by association. Trump's MS-13 comments are not all that different from Bill Clinton's Super Predators line, where they talked about young black men as if they're all, these hardcore, very accomplished criminals. Trump obviously takes it a little further, and he has far less subtlety about it. But that sort of coded race language, or used to be somewhat subtle under Reagan and then Newt Gingrich and others, but Trump has basically just pulled the mask off of it and just more or less says exactly what he means rather than letting people interpret it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like, I think sort of what has changed is that people are much more open and much more easily have disdain both for certain groups in society as well as, simply the other side. It's no longer that someone who disagrees with you is someone who disagrees with you. Someone who disagrees with you is an enemy of the people. I mean, these are the kind of things that Trump is saying. And, someone who, let's say, kneels during the national anthem, they're a traitor. They're not just someone who disagrees. They're someone who's fundamentally dangerous for society. And I think that kind of rhetoric, I mean, it's been used in the past, and it's had potentially dangerous consequences.
I feel like a lot of that part, sort of language of treason and being anti-American, I feel like that was also part and parcel of the Bush administration, especially, well, he's post 9/11, maybe not before then, but there was a very, very much this idea that you're with us or you're against us, and that if you don't support the war in Iraq, you're against the troops, you're against the country, you're against all that is good and holy, and you're enabling terrorism.
Yeah, no, indeed. And if you look at what that was used by Bush, someone who is probably a lot less, at least in terms of that sort of racial, a lot less bad than Trump. But what he used it for, of course, I mean, the mass spying program, the illegal wars. I think if someone like Trump could use something like that, I think he could definitely push for something that's quite disturbing. But we'll see.
Yeah, because I guess for me, the major danger of the next term, and I think this applies to both Trump and Biden, is that there are already people calling for massive budget cuts in order to make up for the spending that took place to deal with COVID-19. And a lot of them seem to be targeting Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And I don't know which of them would be more likely to go along with that. Because both of them, at least, well, especially Biden actually has a voting record of calling for cuts to those things. Because normally you'd think a Democrat would be a little better about that, but Biden's one of the few exceptions.
Yeah, that's honestly a really rough one, because I mean, Trump, ostensibly in the beginning, he was a bit more, populist on some of these issues, at least in 2016. But he did already say that he was willing to cut. I think he said that a couple of months ago, that he would, quote unquote, cut entitlements if he won in 2020. And I think the difference probably is that Trump will be supported by, of course, a Republican Congress that's willing to do that, and Biden less so.
Yeah, I don't know.
But there's more political will.
Yeah, I know Bill Clinton was sort of interested in making some cuts. I mean, he cut back welfare, and then Obama tried to do the grand bargain, which basically I think he wanted to privatize Social Security in exchange for getting the Republicans to agree to nationalize gay marriage, or like some really bizarre deal. And anyway,
that doesn't seem like it's worth it, but okay.
Well, yeah, that's what the Republicans ultimately decided. I think Boehner thought it was insane. And I remember there were Obama supporters at the time who were like, man, that's a brilliant trade. He really stuck it to the Republicans. How?
No, selling out Social Security? Wow.
Yeah, because I mean, if you happen to have a coalition that wasn't super socially conservative, and I mean, social conservatism by that point was already falling off. I think today, if say Biden went to Republican Congress and offered that, they would accept it. because the
Wow.
Republicans. Well, I mean, right now, I mean, gay marriage is already legal anyway, but even a good portion of Republicans are no longer all that opposed to gay marriage. They sort of accept it as inevitable. So if there was a similar issue, say trans rights or whatever, in exchange for privatized Social Security, I think the Republicans would be willing to bite the bullet on that because it would give them something pretty tangible in exchange for something that's inevitable anyway.
But that honestly seems very strange because if there's one thing that is supported probably by a mass of Americans and especially by old people who actually vote, it's Social Security. Like, it seems almost very strange that that's even on the table. It seems like something that should be untouchable.
You would think, and I mean, even Eisenhower once said something to the effect of anyone who would dare go after Social Security is a complete idiot and would quickly find himself in the political wilderness.
Yeah.
And that's been largely true. I mean, the base of both parties is widely supportive of Social Security. Part of the reason why they switched the term entitlement because it was originally called an earned benefit. They called it an entitlement to make it less popular, but even that's kind of failed. People, even though, I mean, I'm not super big on the intelligence of the American voter, unfortunately. They did see through that trick. They did not think that the
Yeah.
word entitlement necessarily made those things bad.
No, true. But I think on that front we could possibly talk about what would it look like if Biden wins. What's your take?
Well, so worst case, I think that what he does is rather than trying to get back to and defending the Obama status quo, he just takes the status quo as it is and defends it. So basically, he just takes the policies that are already enacted and just defends them and makes some sort of small cuts here and there to key programs, but ones that don't attract a lot of attention. And over time, it's just a slow whittling down of the social safety net or what remains of it. I think that's really the most plausible, well, worst case scenario for Biden at least. And then he probably loses in 2024, and we possibly end up with someone like Trump, but more competent.
Wow. Okay, that's very interesting because the way I see it, I think it's most likely that he basically tries to be Obama 2.0. And especially given that he'll probably have a vice president who is, Obama-esque. I guess someone like Kamala Harris is probably not radically different from Obama. And in that sense, I'm not that negative because as far as I can see, Joe Biden is most likely going to, I guess, probably try to push something like a public option. And again, that's incremental change. It's not enough. It's not far enough. But I think one thing that we can't do is when it comes to the Obama presidency, obviously he did many bad things, including, corporate bailout, wars, etc., etc. But something like Obamacare, although again, it's nowhere near enough. Like these were real gains for a lot of people, like 20 million people getting health insurance who didn't have protection against pre-existing conditions. All of these things are like real achievements. And I think Joe Biden will not do anything substantial, but probably something like some kind of Obamacare expansion. Again, it's little, but it will actually help people. But besides that, I don't think he will achieve very much.
I mean, I think he'll try for that. Given the amount of resistance Republicans can mount to any healthcare reforms, there's a good chance he doesn't get that one priority, even though he's basically boiled down his campaign to that one promise.
Yeah.
He also talked about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I guess that would be good if he could get that done. He might be able to accomplish that. Because at this point, $15 is not as much as it was when that initially became a movement about 10 years ago. So it's a lot less of a concession. Aside from that, maybe a handful of tweaks here and there. Even some of the things Obama did were predicated upon him having a few decent people in his cabinet. If you look at some of Biden's prospective cabinet picks, it's just a who's who of Wall Street. And he's even thinking about putting Bloomberg as Treasury Secretary, which would be completely disastrous.
I'm sorry, if he does that, it's ridiculous.
The only people who would be quality who might get into a Biden administration would be in minor positions. Wow. Without much power. But the major offices in the cabinet would pretty much all be Wall Street. So it'd be very similar to the Trump administration. It's just, they wouldn't be anti-gay or whatever, which none of them would have authority over that anyway, so it wouldn't make a difference.
Well, in that sense, I think there are a few other points where he could actually possibly do some good, and that because indeed you mentioned the minimum wage, and I think that's very likely to go through. Because the thing is, the House I think already passed it in was it last year or whenever they did it, whenever they won from Trump. That's like kind of a no-brainer thing they can easily do. And the second thing probably is free college. It's now in his platform. I don't think it's for 100% of people, but it's for most people. And it's something that I don't see which special interest really gets hurt by having free college. It's a relatively cheap program. It's $48 billion. That's nothing in the federal budget.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that would be a progressive achievement. Something in the Sanders platform that possibly could be achieved, especially since it doesn't hurt anyone and it's really easy to pass.
I guess the only people, I guess they don't get as hurt as they used to, but private lenders for student loans would probably be adamantly opposed because they want to go back to the days of student loans being guaranteed through private banks rather than through the federal government. So that's part of why they're opposed to any kind of cost-saving measures or anything of that nature. But, I mean, they're not as strong as some of the other special interests, like, say, the health insurance companies.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because, I mean, even with that, I think even, if, for instance, Sanders had won, I truly wonder how much he would have gotten done, simply because the entire system is so entrenched. There are just so many people who would want to oppose anything that he would try to do.
Yeah, that being said, just by having the presidency, some of the appointments he could make to his cabinet, and then some of the actions that those departments in the federal government could take, even that would be radically different than what a Biden administration would look like. Wow. Say, for instance, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So this is, somewhat minutia in theory, and these wouldn't count as major achievements for a president, but if you had somebody who was an actual consumer advocate in that office rather than just a random corporate person, you could see quite a bit of help for people who were screwed over by, say, fraudulent activities on the part of corporations. Same thing with putting people in charge of the FEC or FCC in terms of curbing corporate abuses, because a Biden administration would be very unlikely to put somebody who actually wants to enforce regulation in those offices. But in terms of major legislation, Bernie would have had a hard time getting stuff passed, although because he would have had better voter turnout than Biden, he would have gotten a few more seats in Congress, and he also is much more consistent on his message. So over time, he could possibly win a few more things and maybe not go lame duck as early. Because I feel like Biden would be lame duck after the first 2 years at best.
Yeah. No, indeed. And on that, indeed, because of course the other part of the harm reduction argument is indeed about sort of policies or things that would or would not get done. And I think one of the big arguments that I'm sure most of you have heard is the argument about the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a powerful argument, because Trump will probably get one or even two Supreme Court nominees, and that's not a minor thing. That's something that will have ramifications for even 40 years,
Yeah.
In terms of any legislation getting passed, even well after a Trump presidency is over.
That being said, if you look at some of the people Obama wanted to put on the court, Merrick Garland, who the Republicans basically burned down the government to prevent getting on the court, he was a pro-corporate guy. He would not have been much different than a Republican in many ways, except on social issues. And I feel like that's one thing. I feel like the argument about the court is actually somewhat overstated, because if you look at a lot of the people that, Merrick Garland-esque people that Biden would be likely to choose, most of them are not against money in politics. Most of them are not the kinds of people who see that as a problem. They also accept corporate citizenship as just an obvious thing. So I feel like there's some threat from a Trump nominations, yes, but at the same time, I think we should be careful about overstating the influence of the Supreme Court.
I would say two things to that. On the money in politics thing, I think either way, money in politics is not going to be overturned without a constitutional amendment. I don't think
Probably
there's any
so.
way to get around that. And on the other thing about the liberal Supreme Court justices only being liberal on social issues, I'm not entirely sure that's true. I mean, not that they're strident progressives, but I mean, even something basic like Obamacare, which was massively, massively litigated, I think it's because of something like Supreme Court nominees that was able to stay. And I think if in the future you want to do, let's say, any kind of even basic healthcare reform, that a majority conservative Supreme Court would just strike that down.
Possibly. I don't know. It's I feel like FDR found a solution to dealing with the court. You have to threaten their institutional power. So a lot of people talk about the court packing as being this thuggish move. I'm 100% in favor of threatening that as a way to get the Supreme Court to back off.
As a threat, maybe.
And
For
also,
me, it's kind of like, I guess for me, it's a utilitarian argument. Like,
yeah.
I only agree with it because the outcome ended up being better, but in principle, I don't agree with it.
I don't know. In principle, I guess if I could rewrite the Constitution, the Supreme Court might not really be a thing, or at least it would be massively cut back in its influence.
Because the thing with that, and this is something that could actually be quite scary, and I'm surprised it hasn't been done yet, is actually packing the Supreme Court. Because I think if that happened, the first president who would do that, you would within like 2 presidential terms have like 100 Supreme Court justices, because every president after that would then try it.
Well, I think what you'd have to
Which
do is set a number, and it would be very hard to increase that number if you manage to increase it beyond the traditional 9. So, for instance, if you went to 13, or I think that was something like FDR was proposing 13 or 15, it would be hard to go beyond that without the passage of a significant amount of time.
I mean, it wouldn't be acceptable, but it's not illegal
Sure.
to do, let's say.
Yeah, it
So,
is surprising no one's tried it. I guess to be fair, I mean, most of the presidents we've had, especially in recent times, despite the amount of political gridlock, they haven't really called for anything that would be controversial. Except for a few things, Patriot Act, Obamacare. Most
yeah.
pieces of major legislation have not really been those kind of things which really raise the question of the role of the government in the same way as, say, Social Security did in the 30s. So I feel like very few presidents have been in a situation where packing the court would make sense, at least up to this point.
No, that's true. And that, I really wonder about the feasibility of do you think Trump would pack the court if it came to it?
At this point, he has the court. I don't see why he would bother packing it. I mean, he got to nominate a few people. Most likely, especially if he gets reelected, which I think we both agree is the most likely outcome. I mean, he'll take
Yeah.
RGB's seat too, or RBG, excuse me. And that would give a 6-3 majority.
Wow.
So, or is it? Yeah, I think it'd be 6-3, and that'd probably hold for the rest of his administration. There'd be no reason to pack the court.
I guess, yeah, I guess that's true and understandable. It just makes me wonder, even without Trump, because Mitch McConnell and the Republicans have really had no qualms about totally violating any kind of norms to get what they want. Thinking about how they, withheld the Supreme Court nomination from Obama and things like that. And I think what Mitch McConnell's pushing now, he's he's encouraging judges to retire early so that they can nominate more Republican judges who will be in power for decades.
Yeah. That being said, the judges are not under any obligation to do so, and I feel like the kinds of people who get to the Supreme Court feel entitled to serve until they're 98. So hopefully they will just stay in office. I mean, in retrospect, clearly Ginsburg should have stepped down during the Obama years, but she didn't.
Yeah. Would have probably been smarter.
Yeah,
unless the Republicans stopped her as well. But
I guess
yeah,
she thought she was going to live forever because she does yoga or whatever it might be. And yeah, doesn't biology wins every time, I guess. So
yeah.
I don't know. I don't understand the mentality of some of the people who get into that office. I don't know why anybody would want to die in office with the heavy burden of serving on the court, doing that shit. In your extreme old age. I don't
I mean,
understand
it's a
what
life
drives
goal.
somebody to
It's a
do that.
dream. It's a dream for these kinds of people, right?
Yeah,
For the profession.
I feel like once you get to about 80 or so, you can retire, and you've probably done everything you're gonna do. It's you just enjoy the rest of your life. Have a little bit of leisure time. Do some traveling. I don't know.
Well, some countries have term limits for Supreme Court justices. Maybe that's a thing. Like a 20-year term limit would be a good idea, perhaps.
Actually, I really like the Canadian system for Supreme Court justices. They're chosen by nonpartisan committees, and I believe they do have term limits of, was it 15 years, something like that?
No,
I
that's
feel like
fair.
that'd be a pretty fair way to do it. And yeah, because the prospect of getting stuck with someone as terrible as, say, Antonin Scalia
Oh
for an
God.
indefinite period of time is absolutely sickening. And yeah, we got a few of those. And I imagine one of the people that Trump's trying to get to step down is Clarence Thomas, who is basically like Scalia but worse, except he's better about not opening his mouth.
Smarter.
Yeah, I mean, he's smarter in that regard because people don't know how terrible he is unless they really look into his record. But he was even more right wing than Scalia.
Really? Shit.
Oh yeah, I mean, like occasionally Scalia would have some sort of nuance. He usually would always vote on the right, but he'd have at least a little bit of nuance. Clarence Thomas would just say, "No, I'm a Republican, therefore I'm voting this way." I mean, there's very little.
Wow.
Yeah, Thomas is an out and out partisan, and his wife was a huge supporter of the Tea Party and a very outspoken one. And it was not terribly lost on anyone that her husband shared all of her opinions, and he was okay with people knowing that.
Yeah, clear. Wow. No, indeed, like the opposite of that, probably of the of the Canadian system, with the kind of outcome that you don't want, is like what I think I discussed this in my Poland video, where the Polish government simply implemented a compulsory retirement for all the Supreme Court judges and just replaced them all with loyalists with loyalists.
Oh God! So a spoil system in the purest sense.
Yeah, no, essentially.
That's
Well,
not good.
maybe America's future.
Yeah, it's also more or less our present in many ways. Because I mean, you look
Well,
at
I
some
think
of the
the
people.
next.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh no, just finish off.
I was just gonna say, we've had a lot of issues with cabinet appointments being given to people who are woefully unqualified because of campaign debts to them, and that really goes back all the way to Andrew Jackson. And it had kind of gone away with the professionalization of the government, but especially under Trump, that is back in full effect because it's very hard to see someone like Betsy DeVos as remotely qualified to be Secretary of Education, or Ben Carson remotely qualified to do anything other than maybe Surgeon General.
So yeah, I'm surprised they didn't nominate him for that, or at least Secretary of Health. You would think maybe.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like, nominate him based on the one thing he's known for, not because he's black. Therefore, he can do urban development. Apparently, I mean, it's insanity.
Oh, the madness of it. No, indeed, that's well. Ironically, that's what. Sorry. No, rampant corruption is definitely something that is massively increased under the Trump administration, and it's really brazen. It's shocking, honestly.
Yes, it's pretty bad, pretty damn bad.
But in terms of the harm reduction argument, I think the next biggest argument that people talk about is climate change.
Yeah,
And I don't know if there are good counter arguments to that because, look, Joe Biden is no, super environmentalist, but it does, I think, make a strong difference between having Trump, who has A, denied climate change, B, essentially gutted the EPA, pulled out of any kind of climate agreements, deregulated any coal mining regulations or whatever. It's essentially the opposite of anything you would actually need to do to tackle climate change. Whereas at least somebody like Joe Biden, you could expect to do some, reasonable, I don't know, green energy subsidy or something, nothing radical, but something.
Yeah, I don't think he'd do very much. I mean, maybe best case he reinstates some of the things that Trump repealed, maybe re-enters the Paris Climate Accord. That being said, because he would take action, and because the Republicans would then say, "Oh, Joe Biden's return to Obama socialism," at that point, the energy for going further than that would be gone, and I think that would be about the limit of what we could accomplish. In some ways, I wonder if it would be better to have a second Trump administration that goes completely to shit, and then everything that Trump supports, including environmental deregulation, becomes anathema to the public. So that way there's a mandate to actually do sweeping climate reform later. But it's a risk either way, because I don't think there's a win to be found there. I think it's choosing between two versions of a loss.
No, not on climate change, I think, because first of all, personally, I don't believe in accelerationism, but when it comes to climate change, I think the difference is that you really are on a time limit. Like, we magically have been given a little bit more time, ironically, by the coronavirus, but
Yes.
besides that, there actually is a time limit. Like, other progressive policies, you can say, okay, maybe we can get it done in 4 years, but climate change is kind of something that really needs to be done now.
Yeah.
And on what you're saying about that maybe there'll be some sort of radical pushback after Trump leaves office, I would say, I mean, if it hasn't happened by now, after 4 years, I don't think 8 years will make much of a difference.
Although it did for Bush, because Obama, after coming in after Bush, could have basically done whatever he wanted to, and he would have had support at first.
Yeah.
He didn't use that at all, but he had the opportunity. But yeah, it's the climate issue. It's a terrifying one, and I think in many ways the fact that it depends so much on U.S. action might end up being why the world is fucked.
In many ways, that's true. Like, I think one of the big aspects about Trump that really is gonna this will be in the history books is sort of Trump's foreign policy and the total destruction within 4 years of America's soft power. Because a lot of America's goodwill, I mean, I don't know if you want to call it goodwill, but, whatever, comes also from soft power. It's not just having a big military. And all of that is gone. It's gone. No one can form an agreement with Trump. Iran deal, Joe Biden can't reinstate the Iran deal. Why would anyone make an agreement with America after Trump ripped up the deal? And the same applies to climate change. Is America is no longer a credible actor, so why should other countries, follow climate change measures that will possibly damage their economies if, America will just tear it up if they get a Republican president?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe the best case scenario, and I don't know how plausible this would be if China decides to try to make up for the sort of damage to their image of COVID-19 by starting to lead the way on environmental reforms. I mean, that's a pretty far-fetched scenario, but I think at this point it's a lot more plausible than U.S. leadership on climate change. Or maybe India randomly, really, I don't know.
Well, China, I don't know. China seems to be blaming the U.S. for everything now, and the U.S. is blaming China.
Yeah, it's pretty embarrassing.
Now, I don't know. Well, to some extent, China is doing a little bit of that, although I think it's less motivated by climate change and more by the fact that their people are choking on their own air in the cities like Beijing.
Yes.
Although they are doing a little bit of mitigation.
That's why it always baffles me that when people try to sell climate change, the need to address climate change here, talking to conservatives, they rarely talk about the personal health aspects of it, and they more or less talk about parts per billion of carbon or whatever it might be. So I think that in terms of environmental messaging, that's something to think about, is just appeal to people's own personal interest. but you end up with basically the same policies either way, regard whether you're just trying to be conservationist or actually just fighting climate change on a grander scale. Most of the policies are basically the same for doing
No, that's
both.
true. Like I saw something, I think it was by Stephen Fry, where he discussed sort of differences between sort of conservative and liberal mindset. And I think it was on the climate change issue that apparently there was some sort of study that if you frame environmental issues not from saving the environment perspective, but rather from the perspective of purity, of cleanliness, of keeping the world clean, of keeping it pure, that's much more appealing to people with a conservative mindset than the arguments that are usually used.
Right, and even with if you frame it in the most conservative way possible, talking about purity and whatever, because of the context of it being about the environment, people on the left would still rally to that, at least
Yeah,
on that
exactly.
in that one context. So it baffles me that this hasn't been tried, and I didn't know Stephen Fry had said that, but that's pretty interesting.
Now it's a very interesting video. I'll probably send it to you.
Okay.
I would probably even go so far as, heck, people should invoke the Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure it says in the Bible something along the lines of that men are the protectors of the earth, that they're meant to look after the creation. I mean, talk to the evangelicals about God and the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Adam and Eve were the keepers of the garden, and then was it be fruitful and multiply? I mean, you have to keep the conditions right to be able to do that. So I mean, you
Exactly.
can make an argument from there. I mean, there are some of the evangelicals here who believe that God wouldn't allow the environment to degrade and that He's going to take care of everything and there's no real worry to be had. Those people are probably unreachable, but I think most people can be reasoned with on that.
That's actually another interesting question. Is that from what I've seen, I think in a lot of polls, a plurality or a majority of Republicans agree that climate change is a problem, but somehow the Republican politicians still call it a hoax or rail against. I mean, obviously it's because they're funded by the oil industry and that kind of stuff. But it makes you wonder if a lot of their voters are on the right side. Isn't there any kind of pressure on them to do something?
Um, that's an interesting question. I feel like a lot of the Trump people I've encountered, they'll admit that climate change is real and it's a problem, but then they'll say that the man-made aspects of it are overrated and it's really just the sun getting hotter.
Uh, uh,
Which I guess in terms of if you watch a lot of documentaries on solar evolution, yes, over time the sun gets larger, more luminous, but that is such a slow process that has nothing to do with climate change today. And I also always try to explain to them, if you look at the period of the dinosaurs, the sun would have been less hot than it is today because of solar evolution, yet the world was definitely warmer. So clearly there are other factors involved.
exactly.
Also, Venus is hotter than Mercury, but it's not closer to the sun. I think you can reach them, but it's a very slow process. The problem is the politicians won't respond because they're all in the pockets of big oil.
Of course, of
So
course.
it's just sort of like the ultimate example of corruption is actually Mike Pence. When he was in Congress, he went on the floor of the House in maybe 2002 or so and said that there's no proof that smoking cigarettes causes cancer because he was taking money from tobacco.
Oh no, that's kind of that's I feel like that's probably like the least respectable special interest. Like, I mean, at this point, if you're still shilling for tobacco, that's low. That's like the lowest you can go.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know?
the only way I could see somebody doing it and coming off as a reasonable person would say, "Hey, it's a product that's bad for your health. However, people should have the right to choose to use it." You know, if you take that position, it's not crazy. But if you're trying to say no, there's no evidence that this is harmful, you're either incredibly idiotic or else you're lying. And I think I'd prefer that somebody just be stupid enough to believe it than actually lie about something so blatantly false.
Well, with politicians, I guess you can never underestimate their willingness to lick the dirt, as it were.
Yes, I think you're right. There's a lot of dirt licking. Um, let's see.
But that being said, do you think, or what are the other harm reduction arguments that you've heard?
It's
Is there any
mostly
other one?
well, it's mostly prospect of Trump clamping down on civil liberties and or doing a coup, Supreme Court choices, and the environment. Those are pretty much the big three that I've encountered. I haven't seen any others. Or I have heard a fourth, actually, now I think about it.
Okay.
So the argument is that if there is a movement which gets progressive legislation to the desk in the Oval Office, that Biden would be more likely to sign up than Trump. Or at least he'd be more likely to champion something than Trump. But I feel like that is engaging in counterfactuals at this point, based on Biden's record.
I mean, to some extent, it is true. I mean, I don't think you can make the argument that Trump would be better for progressive policies being passed or implemented than Biden.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that means that Biden would be better at it than Trump. I feel like this is kind of a wash. There's no real possibility of progressive legislation in the next 4 years.
No, essentially, except maybe criminal justice.
Maybe even there, it would depend on Biden abandoning / forgetting his previous stances on the issue, because his record on criminal justice is pretty damn bad.
Yeah. Although I will say, I think on some of these issues, you potentially could get people to change. I mean, come on, like Obama and Hillary were against gay marriage, but in the end, because I think some of these things, they were done at a time when it was very politically convenient to be on the wrong side. And now that the political winds have shifted, it's not necessarily that Biden would shift with the political winds to some extent, as long as it doesn't hurt his donors too much.
Although, I mean, I feel like he's been pretty much immune to the political currents of 2020. I've seen very little evidence that he's aware of where the public stands on a lot of issues. A couple examples: Medicare for All now has a majority support among the people, overwhelmingly among the base. There's already a candidate in Trump who's anti-Medicare for All, and Biden, instead of saying, I don't support it, but if it passed, I would sign it, he said instead, no, I'd veto it. So I feel like if he were being more clever, he would say that, yeah, if everybody wants it and they pass it, I guess I'll sign it, whatever. But instead, he stamped out all hope. And then on the marijuana legalization issue, it's another thing that now has majority support from the people as a whole, and where you could turn out people for that. I mean, it's not a huge issue, yet people will show up to vote for it, at least some people. And there's already a candidate who's against it, So there's like all these votes out here that you could just go grab, even if you don't give a shit about marijuana, or even if you are slightly opposed to it. But instead, he's like, no, I don't know what it does to people. The science isn't in, so I'm against it.
That one honestly is shocking. Like, even if you assume nothing good about Biden, even if he's a craven politician, that's something you should do, because indeed, as you said, it has majority support. I think it even has a plurality of Republicans.
Yeah.
It's something that doesn't hurt a lot of special interests. I think the alcohol lobby is kind of against it, but I mean, it's already been legalized in like half of the states. It's inevitable. You might as well just do it. Yeah, I mean, it's the easiest thing. It's a no-brainer.
Not only that, but if you think about it, if you regulate and tax it, that's a new source of revenue, so you can advertise yourself as being fiscally responsible and also enabling people to be free.
Yeah.
And also it's criminal justice reform built in, because people won't get arrested over marijuana. So, I mean, it accomplishes a lot of objectives, and you can make yourself appear a lot more open-minded and progressive than you actually are with that one thing.
Yeah, and also
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just the funny thing is that it would also be probably the easiest thing for him to do, because as far as I'm aware, right, he could do it through the back door with executive order. If he just took it away from being a Schedule I drug, that's effectively legalizing it, although it's not yet the full legislation yet. Am I right?
I think. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I think, yes, if you take it off the schedule, it doesn't have a penalty, although that still leaves states open to pass laws against it. But at this point, I don't think many states would be likely to pass specific legislation against marijuana. I mean, except for the usual suspects like Mississippi.
Of course. Always rely on Mississippi.
Yeah, or South Carolina. They seem to have a talent for messing things up.
No, indeed. So I think from there we could perhaps go to the next section of the discussion
Sure.
and maybe start talking a little bit about sort of what Biden potentially needs to do to win the left over, or how he could potentially win maybe with or without the left. Sort of exploring different scenarios for the Biden campaign.
Right. Um. Yeah. The latest polls that I've seen suggest that winning back the left for Biden is going to be very, very difficult at best. I think they said a majority of people who voted for Bernie, about 52%, and one poll said they're voting third party.
Oh wow.
Or not
Okay.
voting, or, voting Trump. So, in other words, not voting Biden.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's looking pretty grim for old Joe.
Now that one's quite shocking. I think that's probably the one that's most disturbing. Although I think other ones show about 3/4 of Sanders supporters going for Biden, but it does depend on the poll. But either way, it is bad for him. But I think one thing that's very interesting is he could potentially win. This is a hypothetical. I mean, it's not. He could potentially win without that much of the left. Like he could win by winning some Sanders supporters, but not as many as you think he would need. And my justification for that is the very interesting poll that you might have heard of that shows that Biden is winning older voters, voters above 65. He's got 52%, Trump just 42%, whereas in 2016, Hillary Clinton had only 45% and Trump had 52% of 65 and older. Biden is winning old people.
Although, to be fair, I think, from what I understand, Hillary's numbers at this point in the campaign were higher than Biden's are.
I think her overall numbers, that's right, but not. I don't think I'm among older people.
Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if that holds or not. I know you mentioned at one point trying to win in the suburbs, but that is definitely an uphill struggle for Democrats because suburbanite voters in America tend to be fairly shielded from the worst aspects of distress when there's a failed presidency, so they're less likely to bolt from the Republicans. They're sort of default Republican voters, and you might be able to win some more of them than usual, but unless the economy is total shit after the end of quarantine in a way where it's, you can fault Trump with it directly, I think the suburbs will be a very heavy lift.
Well, so that's what I would question, because I think Democrats actually probably have an edge in the suburbs, and I'll say there's sort of there's two reasons for that. Is number one, they already had an edge in 2018. Like, for instance, when I visited the States in 2018, I was at the Jennifer Wexton campaign, which she was running for Congress in Virginia against an incumbent Republican in a district that voted for in 2016 for a Republican congresswoman, but voted for Hillary Clinton. In other words, in these suburbs, these Virginia suburbs, you've got people who are who are like center right, moderate Republicans or whatever, or moderate Democrats who are willing to vote for a Joe Biden type character. And I think that those people are kind of fed up with Trump, so they might vote. If it was a sort of a moderate Republican like John Kasich, they would have voted Republican, but they're really fed up with Trump, and they're the kind of people who are much more easily sort of put off by Trump's rhetoric or Trump's social issues. So they don't care too much about economics, but they're really put off by Trump. And actually, those people, perhaps if Bernie Sanders had been the nominee, in that case, they would have considered voting for Trump, because Bernie Sanders, of course, threatens their class interests.
Yeah, although if you're leaning on suburban voters, that is probably going to be a low turnout election, and those can be very difficult for Democrats to win. Yeah, almost every time we've had a low turnout election in the 21st century, and most midterms fall under that heading, it's been pretty damn rough for the Dems.
No, now that's definitely understandable. And then I think the other aspect would be on coronavirus. I think these suburban people, it's true that they're the most insulated from the economics. But if you look at, I think, some of the polls about coronavirus, what you see, I think, is that people don't trust Trump on coronavirus, but they trust him more on the economy than Biden.
Yeah.
So if those suburban voters, if it comes down to the economy, they could break for Trump. But if it comes down to coronavirus and those people, they can stay at home and work from home and do all this stuff that sort of the Democrat would be pushing for, whereas Trump is, pushing to open things up. I think in that sense, they're much more put off by Trump's handling of the coronavirus than maybe working class people who want to get back to work because they need to eat.
Yeah, I feel like I can see Biden pursuing that strategy. In fact, I imagine that is the hope of the Biden campaign in many ways. I've always thought, or at least I've thought for the last several years, that the dream of the Democrats is to be a strictly working or professional class plus minorities party with
Yep,
no economic commitments.
exactly.
And then the Republicans, I would leave the Republicans as the more populist party, but one which never actually means any of the things they say, but with some social conservative leanings, which would be a nightmare scenario because then basically the traditional left is completely and totally excluded from American politics.
No, you're essentially right. What you called it a dream scenario, but it isn't really. It's essentially the shift that's happening in America right now, and honestly
Yeah.
across the West. Like this is a shift that's 40 years in the making. The shift from the left and right being divided by, the issues of class and redistribution to essentially social issues, things like the environment, immigration, gay rights, all of that stuff. That is the new, almost sadly for people who are concerned about working class issues, that's increasingly the new dividing line. And you see it across the world that sort of center left parties are embracing this social liberalism and kind of forgetting about the working class. And I think the saddest thing about Bernie Sanders losing is that, see, Bernie Sanders would have brought back that class rhetoric, but I think now with Biden as the candidate, and whether Trump wins or loses, I think it will much more solidify the divide between Democrats and Republicans being on social issues rather than economic ones.
Yeah, that's why in some ways I regard the outcome of the primary to be so devastating that there is a part of me which thinks that the 2020s decade might be entirely lost in terms of being a period of reform. Because
I
not
don't know
only,
about the. Oh, go ahead. Go
well,
ahead.
the other thing to consider is we're going to have a census this year, which will then redraw
Yes.
congressional districts for the next decade. So I mean, I don't usually give in to not cynicism, but fatalism. There we go. But there is definitely a part of me which suspects that the entire decade is lost already.
I don't know exactly about the entire decade, but certainly the first half. I think I don't think you'll get much in the way until around 2024. And indeed, as I was saying, I really think that the Bernie loss has really solidified, or at least it's frozen the sort of advance of class politics in the Democratic Party. Because
Yeah.
I mean, there are polls showing that there's a tangible demographic of sort of white working class voters who indeed voted for Sanders and then voted for Trump. And those people, if Sanders had won, some of them, not all of them, but some of them would have come back to the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Not
But
only
now those people are gone. They're gone. They're not coming back. They're
not only
gone.
that, but it's also interesting that a lot of what the Democratic strategy fails to take into account is that voters of color under a certain age are also very much interested in class issues. So
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
I've seen all kinds of comments across YouTube like, "Hi, my name is so and so. I'm a 26-year-old black man not showing up for Biden." That's a fairly common thing to see online. And you also look at who actually voted for Sanders in the primary. He had a pretty diverse
No
coalition,
diverse.
including a lot of Hispanic voters.
Yeah, no, indeed. No, I was not referring
Oh,
to like the Sanders coalition as a whole.
no, I know what you
I was
mean.
only referring to like the somewhat more socially conservative, but possibly economically left wing, white working class people who voted for Democrats and then switched to Trump. That small segment.
Yeah, that's a segment for sure. Yeah, it's also interesting to me that the Democrats try to position themselves as champions on the issue of race without acknowledging that one of the major racial problems in America is the economic disparity between white people and other people. So
True.
it's kind of a toothless way to deal with the problem, I feel like at a certain point you have to put your money where your mouth is, and I wonder how long they can continue to coast on talking about race without doing anything, because I think there is a time limit. I was talking with my friend Sean not long ago on here about how the demographic argument is very much based in a static universe which doesn't actually exist.
Mm.
And
No, no,
eventually they will have to take some action to keep voters with them.
no. No, the demographic argument, I think, is totally. I don't know if it's been debunked, but it's totally. It assumes it doesn't know anything about politics. Like the demographic argument assumes that all these new minorities will have the same political positions now that in 40 years or whatever, and it assumes that the Republican Party would never change in order to win votes, which are totally
Right.
stupid.
Exactly.
And there's quite a few indications that, for instance, Hispanics are becoming more conservative over the generations, or even if hypothetically, you would have a minority majority, Democratic forever. After about 10 years, just like with the New Deal era, the Democrats were in power for 20 years. And at some point, the Republicans said, okay, listen, we need to accept the New Deal so that we can get back into power. And that's exactly what would happen if, in this hypothetical demographic scenario, at some point, the Republicans would be okay, listen, we can't win by only appealing to whites. Let's also try and appeal to Hispanics and Asians. And at some point, Mitt Romney or some person like that would win. I mean, it's really, as you said, it's a toothless argument, and it's a lazy one.
Yeah, and also speaking of get the minority party eventually caving to the dominant ideology of the winning party. A similar thing happened with Bill Clinton effectively embracing Reagan's philosophy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that would definitely happen eventually, and at a certain point when you have a two-party system, there is a pendulum effect where people will get tired of one party and vote for the other one almost in a reactive way. So the idea of like a permanent majority. So I think what's his name, James Carville, wrote a book when Obama first got elected, trying to get himself back in the good graces of the
Oh
Obama
God.
administration after race baiting for Hillary. And he was saying that the Democrats would have a majority for the next 30 or 40 years. It would be basically unbroken. So
Well, that that didn't really happen.
yeah, so far that prediction has already been disproven. But I find it funny that he at first was saying that Obama can't win because he's black, and he's helping Hillary do that kind of race baiting in the 2008 primary. Then all of a sudden he's like, wait, no, Obama's the best thing ever. We got the next 30 or 40 years on lockdown, guys. Please let me back in.
No, to quote Bernie Sanders, James Carville is a political hack.
Yes, he's one of the absolute worst. It's amazing to me that he's had the career he's had. I don't understand at all how he got to where he was.
No, indeed. And yeah, that's actually another thing I wanted to ask you about. Is I'm sure you're aware that until around when Trump came, that there's basically two strategies for the future of the Republican Party, right? There's either the Trump strategy of try to appeal to sort of anti-migrant sentiment and all of this, and appeal to kind of a declining white conservative group, or sort of what maybe Bush and some of the other people were talking about is trying to expand the Republican Party to include, let's say, more Hispanics and Asians and such. What do you think will happen after Trump? Like, do you think Republicans will continue? Do you think they will push Trumpism,
It
or do you
depends.
think they will reform?
It depends on how Trump ends up leaving office. So if he leaves popular, then I think that most of the people in the next primary will be Trump imitators. That being said, if you have a plethora of Trump imitators, then it's possible that someone can build a plurality to victory by being something else. So that's how Romney won in 2012, for instance, is that the field was mostly people running as Tea Party-esque candidates. Romney ran as more of a traditional Republican. He got around 40% of the vote the whole time, and no one was able to consolidate against him. So it would depend on the shape of the field. I imagine most of the field will be Trump imitators unless he goes out of office with ridiculously low numbers. So if he goes out the way Bush did, in which case I think we're almost guaranteed to have a very different Republican message.
Yeah. And I think whichever way, even if whether Trump wins or loses, I think probably the Trump imitation scenario is more likely, simply because Trump, I think, is going to hold on to this 40% or so of the country that supports him. Whether he wins or loses, it's gonna depend on that 40 or so percent. And I think even by the time he leaves office, if he leaves, it's gonna be stuck at that 40 or so percent. And so it won't be eminently clear whether Trumpism was super successful or super unsuccessful, because it'll be a thing of, well, it was close either way. It was close either way, and it won't necessarily be clear how much of a winning or not winning strategy. How much of a winning or not winning strategy it could be in the future, because I think, indeed, it will depend somewhat on demographics, whether the Trumpist strategy can win, let's say, in 2024 or 2028.
Right. Yeah, it's their party. I feel like in some ways Trump has exposed the weaknesses of the Democrats more so than given the Republicans a clear path forward. He figured out that the Democrats have completely left their left open on economics, for instance, so he can make some very half-hearted appeals to the working class. He basically just blames China without really offering a solution. So he points to the problem of outsourcing but offers really no solution. But because he's the only person talking about it at all in the general, last time and this time, a lot of voters who have seen their jobs outsourced can just go to Trump. That being said, it's sort of in the same way we're talking about the static problem with the demographic argument. It depends upon the Democrats never reacting, the Trump strategy continuing to work.
Exactly. Although to be fair,
so far they have.
I mean, yeah, exactly. The Democrats have gone with exactly the same strategy as 2016. And I think this is probably the most powerful argument of the, let's say, never Biden people, in the sense that if Biden loses, it will probably fully discredit neoliberal centrism.
Yes, which is ultimately why I am pretty much never Biden. Because I don't see a path forward with that ideology dominant in the party. Indeed.
And that's probably the most powerful argument. I think my only problem with that argument is not so much that, I think it will discredit neoliberal centrism, but I think it's not necessarily right to assume that therefore progressives would benefit in 2024. A, because we don't know what Trump would do in the following 4 years, and B, because I'm not sure that I see a progressive champion in 2024. I don't know who's waiting in the wings, and if progressives have learned the lessons from 2020 of Bernie Sanders losing, if enough people have learned the lessons that they can win a decisive majority in 2024, whoever it is.
Yeah, so I don't know who the candidate will be. My suspicion is that it'll be someone of a Jeff Merkley-esque background. Someone who's, fairly progressive, but not necessarily a Bernie Sanders figure, but then over the course of the second Trump term shifts left some, but in a way that's plausible and doesn't seem fake. And really manages to capture the grievances of the people against, no doubt, the failures of the second Trump administration. And I think also So I think that's probably the most likely left champion would be someone of that caliber. I don't think AOC will be ready, even though she'll technically be old enough.
Yeah.
So it'll probably be someone who's a little less well known, a little less in the spotlight, but also has a reasonably solid track record of being on the left, or at least has evidence in the last few years that they've been shifting in that direction.
You think somebody like Ro Khanna, is that someone realistic?
I could think of worse people, certainly. Yeah, I mean, I could see him pulling it off. That being said, I don't know what his exact path would be, but in a primary field, I feel like he's fairly savvy, and he also seems to have a much better link in with the kind of left outreach platforms. So he's much more attuned to where progressives meet online than pretty much any other candidate would be for 2024. So that might be a built-in advantage. I'm not sure how far he can go with that, but if he were to run, he would have a pretty strong go at things.
Yeah. No, I think in that sense, I think Ro Khanna, indeed, you said he's savvy. I think he's the type, because I don't think I've heard him call himself a socialist. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he's used the word socialist.
I don't think he has either. The one liability he has is that he's fairly pro Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
That being said, it might help him in some ways, because I doubt that Silicon Valley will be too over-empowered by the Trump administration, since that tends to be a group of rich people who back the Democrats and who are socially liberal. So I doubt that they'll be as stained by the Trump administration as most other sectors of the economy. So it'll...
No, indeed.
Yeah, I could see Ro Khanna winning, for sure. That's not implausible.
Now, I think one thing I definitely like about Ro Khanna is that I think he's one of the principal people who's been framing all these progressive policies, indeed not from a socialist perspective, but using words like, the New Deal, or this is just a continuation of FDR. Oh no, this isn't very radical at all. This is simply, what we were doing in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
Sort of very clever and savvy language that would make him seem a lot less radical, because I think that's one takeaway that a lot of people, I don't think, have understood fully yet, is that although Bernie Sanders' policies are a lot more popular now than 4 years ago or 8 years ago, it's still radical. Like, it's still more radical than people think for a lot of Americans.
Yeah, and I think pointing out that there is an American tradition of what we now usually call democratic socialism or social democracy is really key to winning American voters. That's why in one of my previous videos I was talking about the need to Americanize rhetoric, in the sense that there are people who, the only examples you can come up with are European, they'll be like, well, but America's different because reasons. Exactly. If you can point out examples that have already happened here and sort of sew it into the fabric of American politics, then people's guard goes down a little bit more. So the only issue with the New Deal terminology is that there are a lot of people now who don't remember that era at all, even people who were born during it.
Wow.
I mean, because I've talked with my grandparents about this, and they were all born at the height of the New Deal. They were all born under FDR. They don't have any clue that there was a major shift from the New Deal to neoliberalism, unless you explain it to them. And then they can kind of see the evidence, but they don't really understand that in a very clear way. And I think that applies to most of the electorate here. There's not a general knowledge of the progression of history. So it is possible, though, and especially if you explain it and you show how FDR was part of this tradition and how it continued, and then point out some of the numbers, such as inequality decreased during that time, poverty went down. It's possible to make the argument. That being said, one of the counter arguments I have seen people try to use to smear the New Deal, and this was going on during 2016 when some people were saying, oh, Bernie's like a throwback to the New Deal. There were articles published for people saying, the New Deal was very racist. And they just point out the social values of the unions back then, who, all of all the members of which are dead now, as if that's a relevant argument because their personal views were racist. I'm like, well, yeah, but again, they're all dead, and people take their social values with them to the grave. So I don't know what the objection is here.
Yeah, no, that's honestly a terrible argument. I assume that came from sort of identity politics neoliberals.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I had one of my friends is from Ethiopia originally. Well, he's American citizen, but also spent most of his life in Ethiopia. And he came here and very much got into American politics after having never paid attention to it. And I remember he read that article and he was quoting it to me, and we had a long conversation about that.
Oh wow!
Because I was like, "What the hell are you talking about? Yes, that's not accurate. It's a terrible argument." And but anyway, he also, because he's Ethiopian, he assumed that racism towards black people wouldn't apply to him because he has East African features as opposed to West African. And he was shocked one time we were at a bar and this racist bartender called him the N-word because he thought, well, how can you say that about me? I mean, I'm not West African. Come on. So.
No, it's true. There's many people in the Horn of Africa who don't really consider themselves black.
Yeah. So.
But I mean, it's one of these things.
So it's an interesting case, but I don't think that argument, would be all that effective in the grand scheme of things. Although I'm sure that, like your usual sort of woke white liberal and a few of the woke black liberal types would quote it and try to run it, but I don't know how effective it would actually be at stopping somebody from reviving the New Deal label. It's just something to be aware of, I guess.
Yeah. Now, I almost thought you were going to quote Ben Shapiro when he said, "Oh, no, the New Deal actually increased or lengthened the Great Depression."
I've heard that one a lot. That's like every conservative likes to quote that one. Every conversation I've ever had with a Republican goes there somehow.
No, but I think the other big lesson, which I'm not sure people have learned this one yet, is when it comes to polling for support for things like, for instance, Medicare for all, it's a lot more nuanced than people think. Because, for instance, there's one poll which I think Kyle Kulinski referred to, which shows, for instance, that 70% of Americans support Medicare for all, even a plurality of Republicans.
Yes, I've seen that one.
But I think the best source for Medicare for all polling is, maybe you've heard of them, they're called the Kaiser Institute. And it's much more nuanced than that. So that 70% is sort of a high water mark for if you phrase Medicare for all in essentially the most positive way possible. Something like maybe free healthcare or something like that. But it's not nearly. But it kind of neglects the context in which actual politics takes place. So yes, if you tell people Medicare for all or free healthcare, of course, lots of people will support it. But if you tell them, higher tax is going to make you pay higher taxes, then support goes down. And if you say it's going to take away your private insurance, support goes down. If you tell them, oh, but actually you get to keep your doctor, support goes up again. And so a lot of people take sort of these Medicare for all polls at face value without considering what the poll actually says, and without considering that in an actual political debate, you are going to have Republicans and corporate Democrats who say, well, but your taxes will go up and it's going to make you wait in line and it's going to take away your private health insurance and all these things. And if you look at the polls, and this is why I refer the Kaiser Institute, that actually take into account all of these things, the support it's still a lot higher than it used to be, but it's not that high. It's somewhere around, maybe 50%.
Right. No, you're right. I mean, the phrasing on that poll makes all the difference. And even when it's Republican framed, it usually still gets around 50%. But yeah, the 70% one is just if you ask the question point blank.
No, exactly. And I think the other aspect of it is, for instance, the polling that was done during the Democratic primary, the exit polls, which showed something like half or more of Democrats supporting Medicare for all.
Yeah.
Again, that also shows that I think some people are a little bit misled Because, for instance, that polling is showing a slight majority of Democrats. But again, that's not the full population. So that's probably lower in the general population. That's definitely something people need to take into account.
Yeah, that and the primary turnout was pretty low and a lot older than usual for the Democrat
Yeah,
Party. So that's yeah, because you're right though. I mean, it wasn't. In theory, if that 70% number was accurate, then the number for the Democrats should have been a lot higher.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, it's then again, polling for policy can sometimes be rather difficult, especially as you said when the framing of the questions makes so much difference for the outcome.
No, exactly. Because I think that's like the biggest thing. I think there's a lot of progressives who believe that the majority of people are already on our side. And while that's true for some issues, it's not entirely true for a lot of issues. And I think it would be a loss if we went into 2024 still thinking or thinking that everyone already supports us and it's only the DNC stopping us. Not that the DNC is a fair organization or that the media isn't biased. It is. But there is still convincing to do. There is convincing to do. And I think many people really need to understand that
Yeah.
a majority of people at the end of the day, even though, yes, the Democrats all endorsed Joe Biden in one go, at the end of the day, a majority of people did vote for Joe Biden and the neoliberal candidate. That's a fact. The majority of people did not vote for Bernie, and media bias and the DNC cannot explain all of that. We do still need to work on convincing people.
Yeah. I think in that regard, if we can find a younger candidate who can take advantage of sort of the groundwork that Bernie laid, then that will probably help a good deal.
Yeah.
That being said, one other side issue I wanted to bring up is, do you think it's plausible at all that Biden will be replaced at the convention by somebody else?
Oh, that would be, honestly, for the history books, that would be beautiful. I mean, but I don't think it's, I just don't see it happening because it would be such a tough thing to sell. Like, how would you sell it? Like, Biden would have to do something extraordinary, or the Tara Reid case would have to, you would have to literally have tape or video of him doing what he did to her,
Right.
You would have to have basically a black swan event. I just don't see it happening, short of him, dying halfway through the campaign, which is not impossible, but I just don't see it happening. How would they frame it, and who would they nominate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have heard, I mean, there are always people who think that Hillary is inevitable somehow, that she's going to take over the nomination at the convention or be his running mate, and then he, slips and falls in the bathtub. I don't know. There are people who vastly overestimate Hillary Clinton, who always say that she's waiting in the wings to take over.
No.
I don't see it necessarily. That being said, depending on what polls say about how likely the Tara Reid situation is to sway voters, if he does get removed from the ticket, it won't be because he did anything terrible. It'll be because the Democrats are convinced he can't win.
Yeah, exactly. And on that front, there isn't any evidence in terms of the polling that he's a massive loss. Like, the polling is basically showing a close election, and that's what it's going to be. And as I said, I made a video saying this is why he could lose, but again, he could also win. It's going to be close either way,
Yeah.
and I just don't see any black swan event happening for either candidate. Honestly, that's going to radically change the polls.
Yeah, I feel pretty bad for the survivors of sexual assaults who were at the heart of the Me Too campaign, because the Biden candidacy and then the media rallying around him, at least the left media, really that's a big slap in the face for that entire movement.
No, indeed. That's definitely something I also discussed, that this whole Tara Reid thing has completely set back the Me Too movement probably for 10 years. It's completely destroyed the credibility of the Democrats, of the liberal media. It's completely exposed them as hypocrites.
Yes.
And in terms of the election, there's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful ad from the Trump camp that I would like you to see. I don't know if we can show it. I don't know if you can see it, if I can show it to you on the stream. Is that possible?
If you link it to me, I can pull it up in my browser.
Because basically, I don't know where the original is, but it's on a Kyle Kalinske video, so I could tell you.
I might have seen it. Yeah, so far in this cycle, the only ad I've seen from the Biden team that was well done was that one he ran against Buttigieg over the putting lights under bridges.
Yeah.
That was definitely his highlight so far.
Now that one was genius. Like, it makes you wonder who. I feel like these people have the money and the people around them who should be able to make good stuff. Why can't they make good stuff?
Well, once you become one of the major candidates, you overhire all the consultants you can find, and then you just lose any kind of voice because there are too many people in the room. So then you end up not really doing anything. Hillary hired every consultant who's ever lived, and then her messaging was total shit with no real focus. Because they just agreed on the most inoffensive things possible, like civility's good, it's for the children, and it's time for a woman.
All right, I'm sending you the link here, and I think you can skip to about, I think it's 20 seconds in or so.
Okay, let's check out some secular talk.
Welcome, Hillary. It's great to have you here.
I am thrilled to be part of your campaign, to not only endorse you, but to help highlight a lot of the issues that are at stake,
A former U.S. Senate employee has come forward alleging former Vice President Joe Biden sexually assaulted her.
His hands were on me and underneath my clothes.
You have a right to be believed. We're with you.
Do we value women? Do we believe women?
Women should be believed.
We believe women.
I'm very disappointed that there are those who continue to not believe women who come forward. It is not easy, but they should be believed.
She is putting herself out there, knowing that they're going to try and excoriate her. And she has the courage to come forward. She has nothing to gain. So what does she have to gain?
I stand with survivors.
The woman should be given the benefit of the doubt.
These white men, old, by the way, are not protecting women.
Show the kind of compassion and caring that we need from our president, and which Joe Biden has been exemplifying throughout his entire life.
Look, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Hillary for joining us in this conversation today.
Ouch. Yeah, that's a pretty good ad. I don't think I've seen that one. Yeah, and also he puts his little labels in: Sleepy Joe, Crooked Hillary, all that.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a throwback, but also pointing out the clear failings of both Biden and the Democrats all in one ad. It just basically shows the dishonesty without having to even say a word.
If Trump bombs the airwaves with that ad, I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, especially I don't think Biden will be able to hit back with anything very solid. And largely it's because, like I said, with the consulting around Biden, the message is going to be muddled, and there's not going to be a strong voice emerging from having 85 different consultants.
No, exactly. And the sad thing is that I think his advisors are telling him to, I mean, not to out-Trump Trump, but indeed to move from the right. For instance, on the China issue, now he's trying to be, tougher on China than Trump, which is a fight he will obviously lose because, I mean, Trump is the anti-China guy.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. That's also why I wonder when it comes to embracing issues. Sometimes candidates are obsessed with never taking an issue as under 50% approval. But let's say an issue was 51 to 45 with the rest undecided. I think there's a case to be made that if your party is naturally going to be weaker on that issue in terms of embracing the popular position, that it would be smart to take up the other positions. That way people for whom that issue is paramount will have a champion. and will be likely to show up with enthusiasm. But anyway, that's just sort of my general political science idea, I guess.
No, exactly. Especially if it's like a very partisan issue, like indeed, say that the Democrat position has 45% support. That would mean that, something like upwards of 90% of Democrats or whatever would support that issue, even if overall they're still a minority. Like, that would probably not hurt you very much, especially if it's not that important of a thing.
Yeah, especially as long as you don't make it the centerpiece of your campaign, as long as you just say, yeah, I'm on that side. That's why I found it weird that Kerry did not run as anti-war in 2004, even though he had the bona fides for that because of his stance back during the Vietnam period.
Well, I'm not sure about Kerry, because I don't know exactly how the sentiment was exactly in 2004 in America, but weren't a lot of people still pro-war at that time?
It was still a slight majority opinion, but at the same time, there were some people who were vehemently anti-war and who were absolutely furious that the Democratic nominee was not with them. And I think that helped drive down his turnout, probably more than any other single issue.
Wow.
So, and maybe he was just eyeing the swing states, and he felt that places like Ohio and Florida were more conservative on war. But I guess that also points out another thing I see as a flaw in the Biden campaign, and why I also think it's as comparable to 2004 as is to 2016. Namely, that Biden seems to be eyeing a narrow path to victory by winning slight majorities in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very high-risk, low-reward strategy if you're only looking to recreate the 2016 map and just barely eke it out, whereas you barely lost it before.
I mean, it's kind of it's a tough call. It's a very tough call, because it really was only 100,000 votes that separated them, and so many different factors played into that, and it's not really clear how that would be affected in this election. But isn't there also the sort of alternative strategy? What is it? The Sun Belt strategy, that he will win potentially, maybe in Arizona or North Carolina or Florida, and that he could win that way.
That applies more to other nominees. Biden's lack of strength with the Hispanic vote basically excludes that possibility. I mean, a lot of other Democrats could possibly go that route, but Biden's not one of them.
Yeah.
He has more appeal with, I guess, traditional Democratic voters. But that being said, because he has eschewed any kind of a class message, the states he really is aiming to win in the Midwest become more unlikely.
So where do you think this, and it increasingly seems like a myth, that Joe is, middle-class Joe, and he really, really appeals to white working-class people. Where does that actually come from?
I think that was part of his mythos back in 2008 when he was trying to win the primary, and then when he was pitched as Obama's VP, because the idea is that he wins white voters and that he has the foreign policy experience that Obama lacks. So they were trying to make the argument that he balances the ticket, partly because they were choosing two candidates, neither of whom was from the South, and the traditional thinking up to that point is that you always need a Southerner on the ticket, either on the top or the bottom. So we're trying to justify not having one, and partly they were saying, well, it's because Biden is so good with this demographic, and then they had him going to union halls and talk about growing up in Scranton. But I don't think he did that all that much prior to 2008, unless it was on rare occasions. And he certainly was not a huge union guy.
Because it really is confusing, because nowadays, rather than talking to union workers, he's trying to fight them.
Yeah, I mean, he's trying to fight them. Kirsten Gillibrand's trying to lecture them on white privilege and male privilege. It's a complete disaster.
No, it's really getting bad. And on that front, what do you think about potential impacts of different vice presidential nominees for Biden?
Especially thinking about the strategy he's pursuing electorally, I think his best bet by a long shot, if he's trying to win, would be to take Tammy Baldwin as his VP. Because she's from Wisconsin? She's from Wisconsin, and she also has a pretty strong record on economic issues that Biden simply doesn't have, and that also neither Trump nor Pence has. She also is pretty competent. Unlike a lot of the people on the list, she could govern as president. She has the experience. So I think she would be far and away the best choice if he's trying to win. And if he is trying to win back some of the left, she would win back more than most of the other picks. I don't know who else would really get him where he wants to go. I can think of people he would like more personally, and that who he and his consultants would think would be better. But in terms of somebody actually being better, I just don't see it.
So, just quick questions before I get to my point. Is Tommy Bolden a senator or a governor?
Senator.
And has she been senator for long?
Couple terms, I think. I think she's a second-term senator, so she's got a decent amount of experience, but she hasn't been in D.C. for 40 years or anything like that.
And there's no danger that... Sorry, and there's no danger that she would... that her becoming VP would make Democrats lose that Senate seat.
It's possible, but I don't know. And I guess if she could put the Democrats in the White House, that's a pretty small trade to make.
Yeah.
That being said, I'm not sure if she's up for election this year. Otherwise, it would fall to the governor to appoint a replacement, or they have a special election. Wisconsin's a state that can go either way, so it wouldn't be a guaranteed loss by any stretch of the imagination. That being said, because I've heard people say take somebody from a safe area, but I think a lot of the people promoting that idea are people who want to see Warren chosen. And the fact is, I don't think Warren brings very much.
No, she's actually not safe. Like, she's one of the most unpopular senators in the country, and she could actually lose. I mean, maybe she wouldn't lose, but if she was VP, the Democrat could actually lose that Senate race.
Yeah, although, I mean, I think a generic Democrat replacing her would probably poll better in the Massachusetts Senate race, as long as it's not Martha Coakley, who goes out and talks about how great the Yankees are. Because she barely lost that race in a low turnout and where there was Obama backlash. So it's very hard for Democrats to lose in Massachusetts, and the fact that Warren, who's an awful politician, was able to still win by about 10 points shows how strong Democrats are there. Because the normal Democrats win by about 20. So Warren was bad enough to lose 10 points and still win.
Damn. Okay. Well, in any case, there's actually a really, really, really interesting take that I came across today, based on a book. And this is about vice presidential candidates. And essentially, the take is based on a study that was done about all vice presidential candidates between, I think, 1884 and 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, the core finding is this: the home state of a vice president doesn't matter at all. Like, there's no statistical evidence that a vice president being from a particular state increases like votes for that for the party in that state any more than normal. No evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, I've always sort of suspected that, but I'm glad there's a study that shows it.
No, indeed, it's essentially the study shows that, and then the only exception is if the VP nominee is from a relatively small state, and they are themselves incredibly well-known, popular, long-serving. So someone who's really kind of like an institution in that state, someone who is synonymous with the state. You know, someone, let's say Vermont was a swing state, then nominating Sanders would be a really good idea. But in any other case, there's no impact. Even they debunked in the 1960 election, Lyndon B. Johnson did not help John Kennedy in Texas or the South at all. Like, in fact, he was slightly less popular in the South than in the North.
From what I understand, a lot of the reason that Kennedy picked Johnson is because he was afraid that if he didn't, Johnson would take offense and undermine his campaign.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and apparently Robert Kennedy, because they put Lyndon Johnson on the list of VPs as a courtesy because they knew that he had to be appeased due to his power in the Senate. And Johnson pretended to not understand the meaning of the call, and then he called back the RFK and was all enthusiastic about how excited he was to work with Kennedy and how thankful he was that they had chosen him. So then they were basically forced to choose him.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the, I guess, savvy politics, eh?
Yeah, and LBJ was a ruthless mofo, for sure. But anyway, in terms of other VPs, I mean, I still think that it'll be someone relatively obscure like Cortez Masto out of Nevada.
I don't know.
And I think the reason is because the Democratic strategists are very obsessed with the idea, one, of a racial balance, because they know that Biden's weakest demo is with Hispanics.
Yeah.
Two, she's unknown, so there's not a lot of dirt there. Mm-hmm. And three, she because she's unknown, she doesn't come with a lot of negatives. I mean, Biden clearly already has a lot of baggage. He doesn't need more, and she doesn't bring more.
I guess, yeah, that is a perspective. But I personally wonder why there's no whatsoever thought, because, I mean, this is kind of a common thing in politics in general, to do exactly, what Trump did. Nominate someone from the other wing of the party to shore up your base. But there's essentially almost no... I think the closest thing would be an Elizabeth Warren, but even that, apparently Biden's donors are saying no to that. And that would be, a piecemeal concession.
Well, there's a double standard within the party, and I think it applies to all politics. If the opposite wing of your party is to the right, then you're expected to appease it. If the opposite wing of your party's to the left, you can just tell them to go fuck themselves. I mean, I feel like that's almost a rule in American politics, at least in terms of the common sense, if you want to call it that, of American politics.
Wow. Yeah, it's a little bit sad actually, but
yeah.
But do you think nominating any racial minority, a black or a Hispanic woman, will impact turnout among minorities? Do you think it'll have any impact realistically?
Not really. That being said, I guess one of the problems is you can't just choose somebody who's popular and exciting because of Biden's clear physical limitations and the probable need for somebody to take over. So you have to also find somebody who's capable of being president. And I imagine when these people are being weighed out as candidates, when people are weighing their choice, they're going to be thinking very hard about that person as president. So these people are going to be much more scrutinized than normal VP picks.
No, exactly.
So otherwise, I've heard people in sort of a left-wing, sort of Bernie fantasy scenario where Biden picks Nina Turner. The problem is that Nina's resume is a little thin for that position. I mean, maybe if Biden were younger and unlikely to ever need to leave office, in that case, you could pick Turner for the way that she unifies the left. Also, would be historic, being the first black woman, etc. But because it's someone who will have to take over, the establishment doesn't want to turn the country over to a progressive one. And then two, you have to sell this person's resume to the public as a whole. And
exactly.
So that's why I don't think Nina Turner is a realistic pick.
No, I think even if it was Bernie Sanders as the Democratic nominee, I don't know if it would be a good idea for him to pick Nina Turner, because I understand that she's, popular and a good surrogate for him. But indeed, as you said, I mean, she was a state senator. I mean, the same applies for Biden picking Stacey Abrams. I feel like Stacey Abrams is basically like, the black female version of Beto O'Rourke, someone who was a popular statewide candidate who lost, someone popular for losing, essentially, but who doesn't necessarily have that many actual achievements.
Exactly. And the whole thing about Stacey Abrams is that, if anything, she has proven herself to be opportunistic and power hungry in a way that will definitely be used against her politically. Trump will be running ads about her as the Black Hillary or something like that.
Oh God!
Yeah, it would be rough. The other thing to keep in mind, keep in mind that with female candidates, there's a double standard. It doesn't necessarily apply to male candidates, at least right now in America. and that's that women candidates need to be reasonably presentable, physically speaking. And I mean, Stacey Abrams, not all that attractive, honestly. I mean, I don't want to be a dick about it, but I mean, there is a double standard when it comes to gender in American politics, and I think that in some ways the right is salivating because they know they're going to be running ads about Stacey Abrams' looks.
Oh God. Yeah, that's honestly really that's really fucking low. Like that's cringe, but it's what you can expect from the right these days.
Yeah. So I feel like they want Stacey Abrams on the ticket. The other thing is I'm trying to think who would. Oh, the worst case scenario, I think, in terms of the worst possible person that Biden could pick.
Klobuchar.
Well, Klobuchar would actually not be the worst. I think the worst would be Kristen Sinema out of Arizona, because she's as right wing or more right wing than Biden, so she would do the exact opposite of balancing the ticket.
Oh wow.
She would overload the right wing of the ticket, and then the party would capsize. And yeah, but I feel like when I was looking at her resume and her personality, I think that if Biden's basing it on who he likes, I think that he and Kristen Sinema would be BFFs. So I feel like if
really?
I just get that sense that there's some camaraderie there. There would be in theory. I feel like he would see her as being someone who's really awesome, that he would want to promote and get into the top tier of politics.
But is she white, or what race is she?
She's white. She's fairly young. She's in her early 40s. She's bisexual. She's from Arizona, and if anything, she's to the right of Biden in terms of her voting record. So she would be part of that whole abandon any pretense of economic populism and go full on appealing to the suburbs and social issues. So I feel like she'd also have some supporters among the class of people who advise candidates. Should also have, I think Biden would like her personally because they're two of a kind in many ways. And if she were to be nominated, I think that at that point, Biden's chances of winning anybody over from the left go straight down the toilet.
True, but based on what you're saying, I don't think, even just from the Biden perspective, I don't think she brings sort of anything to the table that the other sort of Biden potentials would bring, because I guess Arizona is a swing state, but I think their focus will be on the Rust Belt, so better someone from the Rust Belt, and she's not non-white, so she doesn't bring that to the table either. So the only thing she brings is that she's a woman, essentially.
Yeah. Although Biden did back down from the part of his promise that said a woman of color. Now, he never actually said explicitly it's going to be a woman of color, but he reiterated about a week ago, or maybe a little longer, that he's not bound to pick a woman of color. Which made me think Sinema's just a little bit more plausible than before.
No, because didn't he promise a black woman Supreme Court judge?
I think he did, yeah. And I think some people took that as being a promise to pick a black woman or maybe a Hispanic woman as VP.
No, in that case, I don't think he will, because I think he feels like he's kind of satisfying both. That, okay, for the black people, you've got your judge, and for women, you've got your VP and potentially president.
Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see who he actually chooses, especially if he finds somebody who's not being discussed right now.
No, that would be I mean, based on what you've said, probably the best choice that's realistic for that he would pick and good for the left would be, indeed, as you said, someone like a Tammy Baldwin.
Yeah, and I think when I made my little list, because I tried to prioritize them in terms of likelihood, I think she was about 7th or 8th most likely.
Cool.
But, I mean, again, I could be wrong, and I don't know exactly who's advising him, because at this point it's pretty much every consultant in the party, and it's also unclear who he'll end up listening to. And also it's interesting because I guess they asked Bernie if he would endorse Warren for VP, and he sort of subtly said no.
Oh, yeah. What was that about? I don't understand the logic behind that.
Well, I don't understand why they asked him, because it's not his choice to make.
Yeah.
But it's clear now that the bad blood between Bernie and Warren is very real. It's not just speculation. But I think Bernie's more focused on the platform, because I guess he thinks of the personnel race as being totally lost already.
Yeah, that's definitely true. For him, I don't see what he gains by doing or not doing that, because he's already endorsed Biden, so it'd be weird not to endorse his VP. Plus, do people need to endorse the VP? I didn't even know that was a thing. I thought
I think it was just like this novel invention to try to create drama, because they were asking him if he would support Warren as a VP pick, and I think what he's trying to do is evade the question, because he already endorsed Biden, therefore he'll endorse the ticket.
Yeah.
But I think they were trying to get him to say, I want Warren to be VP, and that would appease my voters. I think that was the answer they were looking for. Either that or him to say, no, I hate her, to get the headline. But he didn't. He more or less said no. I don't think he was trying to necessarily snub her, but the way he said it apparently struck some people as him not being a fan of Warren.
Nah, makes sense. Nah, definitely, I think Warren is one of the strangest politicians for me, I think, to understand, because so many of her actions, like all her calculations, seem to fail somehow.
Well, she's not
nothing
good at
she's
politics.
done has helped her.
Also, she's trying to form a group now called the Warren Democrats, which would only further divide the left by taking her partisans and separating them from the rest of the left. And it's a group dedicated to one person, so it's not at all consistent with left ideology or goals. And it's also basing it around somebody already in their 70s, so it's a group destined to only last a decade at most. It's a
she's going to run
idea.
for president. She's definitely going to run, I think. 2024? I see it happening.
I bet so. That being said, I don't know who she gets to vote for at this point, aside from her hardcore. She doesn't have much credibility on the left, and the center will never trust her either. So, I don't know where she goes.
Well, I think it depends on who's in the field. Imagine, for instance, that she's the most left-wing candidate in the field.
Which is possible.
Then I could see a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters having to go for her because, yeah.
Yeah, that's
who
true.
else?
I mean, yeah, I would definitely support her over, I don't know, Gillibrand or whoever else might be in the field. So her candidacy would depend on there being no one else from the left and then people begrudgingly backing her. But in terms of winning the kind of support you would need to get people knocking on doors and all of that, she's burned a lot of bridges.
Yeah.
And I think that her winning a nomination would be very contingent upon everybody else making mistakes, and also her learning how to do politics, which at this point in her life I think is unlikely.
But it also just seems so strange, given that she started as someone who, and even sometimes still is someone who, has made real good progressive policy accomplishments when it comes to, Wall Street and banking and finance regulation and these kind of things. Like, you can't deny her on those things, like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Right.
See, it seems strange that she would renege on that.
Yeah. I don't think she has reneged on that part of her platform, although if Biden were willing to pick her as VP, I think that she'd be willing to abandon a whole hell of a lot.
Yeah, no, most likely. I think if she became the VP, she would probably get a little bit of her pet project. Like, they would probably improve somehow or do something with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, get some extra things or some extra regulations. And then for the rest, that she would kowtow to Biden.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to say. I'm not a big Warren fan. Oh, my phone's going off. Alright, there we go. No shit. I wanted to hang up. Hang up. Alright, I think I hung up. My phone doesn't respond very quickly. It's kind of on its last legs.
Oh, God.
But, yeah, this is just another spam call from some random number.
Oh, God.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Do we have anything else on the agenda? Oh, yeah, institutions that the left can use to move forward.
Oh, yes. So yeah, indeed. I think in one of your past videos, you've also discussed that the left needs to not just focus on presidential politics or electoral politics, but also on local politics and on non-electoral politics, on organizations, indeed, like trade unions.
Right.
And I definitely agree, because at the end of the day, the president is just one part of getting things done, and so much more really broad institutional change is needed at every level. Like, we can sit here and complain that Biden won't legalize marijuana, but in the meantime, you can fight for legal marijuana in your state. You could, talk about there not being free college, but you could potentially get free college passed in your state. And so these are all avenues that the left probably needs to work harder on in the United States.
Yeah, and also to tie it back to the harm reduction argument, I think the harm reduction argument on the state level is far stronger than on the federal level. Because if you look at the kind of major right-wing shifts that have happened policy-wise in the last 10 years, especially between 2010 and 12, states are where those kind of reforms can be enacted very quickly, and where there aren't very many institutional barriers to, say, gutting a social safety system or gutting an education system, or a pension system, or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think we need to pay a lot more attention, especially to governor's races and state houses.
No, it's honestly shocking that, in America, which has a slight Democratic majority, that you have, is it 30 states or more that have Republican governors?
Something like that. I mean, I guess, too, if you think about it, a lot of states are small rural states, say, almost all the country between the Mississippi and the West Coast, really, in many ways, except for Texas.
Yeah.
So that makes sense why they have that, and why they also have some built-in structural advantages with the Senate. Because each state gets 2 senators, regardless of how many people they have. I mean, Wyoming has, 300,000 people, or some insanely small population. If they were to be moved to another state, they wouldn't warrant an entire representative, necessarily. But yet they get 2 senators, and they get 1 representative just by virtue of existing. But I think now it's about 800,000 people to a representative in states that have more than 1.
Kind of ridiculous, but yeah.
It's a rotten borough at this point, the Senate is, in many ways.
No, indeed. And then the other thing, and I think you're probably more knowledgeable about this, is things outside of sort of electoral politics. Because, I mean, unionization in America is in massive decline. I think the unionization rate in America is 11%, which is ridiculous, and it's lower than most other developed countries. Like, it's declining worldwide, but for instance, in a country like the Netherlands, I think it's something like 35%, and in Sweden it's maybe 50 or 60%.
Yeah, I think part of it is in the U.S. there needs to be a lot more focus on labor organizing to set up new unions, especially in the service industry. And there's been a movement for that for a while now. I mean, there are dedicated organizations within McDonald's itself, but also among different retail chains. McDonald's started something, I can't remember the name of it, it's some ungodly acronym, where all the fast food people get together and they do training on how to fight unions. And they have a common fund that they have for people who bust up unions. And Walmart has a similar thing. They also have basically propaganda videos when you're hired that tell you how evil unions are and how they're just there to steal your money.
Oh God.
And so there's a lot of organized opposition to unions. That being said, an increasingly large number of Americans are aware of the benefits of unions because they don't have them. So if we can push hard to unionize big sectors of the economy which are currently unrepresented, that could change the calculus considerably, and also, without even passing much legislation, very much positively impact the lives of many common workers.
No, I agree. Like, if you look at what's happening right now with Amazon and the strikes, wildcat strikes going on there, I think that's really something to watch, because that's grassroots, that's people-led, and they could probably be crushed, but that's something that's going to have ramifications in the future.
Yeah. Also, Amazon here in Columbus is absolutely evil. They are located in what is known as a free trade zone, which is an area not subject to state laws for labor. And their warehouse workers are not allowed to take bathroom breaks or wear coats in the winter. And also, I don't think it's air conditioned in the summer. And they calculated that it would be cheaper to keep an ambulance on standby than to put in an air conditioner.
What?
Yeah, people have died at that warehouse. And mostly the people who are working there are black people in the city. And most of them only have to work at Amazon because the two big factories in Columbus that were here until about the year 2000 or so outsourced. So it's mostly poor black people from a couple of neighborhoods who are bussed in to work at Amazon and then, in many cases, work to death.
And this sounds like something that happens in a third world country. This is the kind of stuff you expect to happen in Indonesia or Bangladesh.
Well, yeah, that's why they have. That's why it's a free trade zone. So that way you can experience all the glories of the third world. You know.
Wow.
Because obviously you can't do that in most places in the States in terms of denying bathroom breaks, encouraging employees to wear diapers, not allowing them to wear coats when it's cold. I mean, those are just not things you can do, even in the most conservative states in America. Even in Mississippi, this would not be allowed.
But wait, how were these free trade zones created? Like,
I'm not
this
sure.
is something. I mean, I'm aware of it in countries.
Some weird legal loophole that they figured out. I think it's the Rickenbacker Free Trade Zone because it's technically part of an airport, or I don't know. It's some ridiculous technicality they figured out how to do this.
Shit. That's criminal, honestly. It's criminal.
Yeah, I think they do adhere to wage laws, though. So that's pretty much the only one they recognize. But in terms of the treatment of employees, employee safety, there's none of that.
Shit. Now that's very rough. But how realistic? I mean, we do see some of these grassroots movements. But do you think it can gain any steam? Let's say in the next 4 years.
It's always possible, but I don't know. I don't know exactly what it would take to cause, say, a general strike. There's been talk of it, which is good, but in terms of it actually going down, I'm not sure what it would need as a spark.
No, it's very rough, and I think possibly labor power could be undermined precisely because of this economic crisis. Because now with the unemployment figures, I mean, the latest unemployment figures, it's above 14%. Like I think they can much more easily now say, well, you want to strike? Fine, but we fire you and we hire the next 10 people who are waiting in line to get a job.
Although the great big general strikes that happened in American history mostly occurred during the Great Depression.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is like, it's counterintuitive, but that's when a lot of them happened. The San Francisco General Strike, I believe, was 1934, perhaps. And yeah, I don't know, because like you're saying, yeah, there's going to be plenty of scab workers available, but at the same time, if the conditions are generally held to be deplorable, and everybody agrees to go on strike at once, or at least all the people who are actually essential, who are mostly all low paid in America, go on strike at the same time, well, that would pretty much forced the hand of business owners. And
Wow.
then I guess the question is whether governors and the president would call in the National Guard to break it up, which is hard to answer.
Well, I think if it's a Republican, that will definitely happen. I just don't see them supporting the union workers. It's not their base. It's not people they care about.
Although
and it's against their interests.
Although possibly, depending on how they want to market themselves, I could see a couple of Republicans trying to take up the brand of being pro-union, at least in the Midwest or in some places. I mean, I could imagine a couple of renegades trying to set up their own brand. Kasich didn't do that quite, but he did initially campaign on screwing over state unions, and then when he got resistance, he backed off. And then that basically made him acceptable to them, and that's why he got reelected pretty easily.
Okay. No, but I think when it comes to winning union votes, it's got more on the Republican side. I think it's got more to do with social conservative issues or general dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party suddenly becoming pro-worker.
Yeah, although it's interesting to note within the 11% of Americans who are unionized, 7% are public unions at this point, teachers unions, people who work for the city. And those, I doubt, are actually socially conservative.
No, those ones definitely not.
Yeah, so imagine at this point, because of the shift in where the unions are located, if anything, unions are all the way on the left across the spectrum, if you're taken as a whole, just because of the strong professional class presence within those unions.
True. When it comes to public sector unions, that's probably true. But like manufacturing sector, I think there's quite a few. I think Trump won. I mean, I think he lost the union vote, but I think he won a lot higher than other Republican presidents in the past.
Yeah, I think that's largely because he talked against outsourcing, whereas Hillary was 100% free trade and was all in favor of the TPP. Not to mention, a lot of unions, their membership wanted to endorse Bernie in the primary, but the leadership just sprang for Hillary pretty much automatically, and that pissed a few of them off.
Well, yeah, I mean, they tried to pull the same thing in Nevada, right, with the culinary workers union.
Yeah.
Trying to stop him from going for Bernie.
Yeah, because, I mean, not surprisingly, people who work in kitchens for low wages support, the more economically progressive candidate. Who would have thunk it?
Yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
No, indeed, the new working class is not manufacturing workers. It's people who work in Walmart. It's people who work in Amazon and in casinos, and those people support Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why, not to beat a dead horse too much, but it's still shocking to me that Bernie didn't make a stronger case for electability, and he didn't challenge Biden's notions of electability more.
Yeah. No, indeed, I definitely think he could have, made the argument that, listen, if it's Biden, this is going to be Hillary 2.0. We all saw what happened there. The working class is going to abandon him, and I'm the only person who can get those crossover voters. He should have definitely made that argument.
Yeah, and I think he could have made a pretty compelling case. He probably also could have cited stats that would help back up his case, because, I mean, Bernie knows just about every stat that the Census Bureau produces. So he easily could have made that case and made it in a fairly compelling fashion, but for whatever reason, he chose not to go that route and to focus instead on the moral necessity of the things he's proposing.
Exactly. All right, man. All right. I think...
I think we took care of the agenda.
A discussion.
Yeah, we pulled off the leftist agenda. Yeah, so...
We have all the answers, guys. Don't worry.
Yeah. At least we have all the questions. Or at least...
That's true. That's true.
Well, thank you for joining me here today, My Take. You can find him on YouTube. What you can do is you can post a link to your channel, and I'll pin it. And that way people can find it most easily. All right.
Perfect.
Yep.
Thanks for watching me, guys. And this was My Take.
All right. And this has been Thersites the Historian. Peace out.
Peace out.